I invite you to listen to my original story on the Purple Heart Stories channel. I really hope you'll enjoy it. Please support with a like and subscription if you do. Chapter 1: The Fall. My name is John Riley. I'm 42, a former F-16 fighter pilot, now working in civil aviation. Once I thought I'd already lived through the worst in my life, in Iraq, where I buried friends and my own soul. Then came the death of my younger son Ethan, 12 years old, in a car accident that I will never forgive myself for, because I was behind the wheel at the time. My wife Sarah, a former military psychologist, helped me cope with PTSD after the war, but after our son's death, which was my fault, there's an immeasurable abyss between us. What happened next proved one simple truth. When you think you can't fall any further, life happily shows you that you're wrong. Emergency: landing in the jungle. At 20,000 feet, the air is thin and cold. In the cabin of the experimental Cessna XR-7, you don't feel it, but I know. Outside it's -50 and every drop of moisture freezes instantly. Right now, that was the least of my problems. The instrument panel, which usually calms me with its steady glow, had turned into a pulsating red nightmare. The pressure in the hydraulic system was rapidly falling. No, not falling. It was plummeting with the same speed as a shot-down helicopter. I'd seen enough of those in Iraq. Sierra Alpha 17 calling control. I have a critical drop in pressure in the main hydraulics, requesting emergency corridor for immediate landing. Silence, just white noise in the headphones. The radio had also failed. This was no coincidence. I wrestled with the controls, trying to level the aircraft, but the ailerons barely responded to commands. The plane began to tilt to the left, gradually entering a death spiral. Sweat was pouring into my eyes, but I couldn't afford even a second to wipe it away. My hands moved automatically, working through procedures I had practiced thousands of times. Only in simulators, you know that if you make a mistake, you'll just start over. Here, there would be no reset. Through breaks in the clouds, I could see the endless green carpet of jungle. Not a single clearing, not one suitable landing spot. But there was no choice. The altimeter was counting down the last few thousand feet with the merciless precision of an execution timer. 15,000, 12,000, would I make it? A memory flashed in my mind. My last argument with Sarah before this flight. Her words, thrown with icy contempt. Isn't having your son's death on your conscience enough? Do you want Michael and Emily to become complete orphans? Those words had wounded me then. Now they resonated with prophetic cruelty. 8,000, 5,000. There, a barely noticeable gap between the masses of trees. A tiny river, winding like a silver snake through the jungle. Not ideal, but better than crashing into a solid wall of tropical forest. I pointed the nose of the plane toward this sole hope, ignoring the creaking and groaning of engineering that refused to obey me. 2,000, 1,000. At the moment of contact with the first treetops, I was pierced by absolute clarity. The hydraulics had been deliberately damaged, too precisely, too professionally, just like the brakes in the car where Ethan died. This was no coincidence. Someone was trying to kill me. The metal around me turned into a mad symphony of screeching and cracking as the fuselage began to tear against the treetops. Something sharp pierced my side. The instrument panel moved toward me with monstrous speed. The last thing I felt was the wet pulsation of blood on my face and thoughts of my children, Michael and Emily. Who would tell them the truth if I died here? Darkness came suddenly, like a switched-off light. Unsettling homecoming. 3 days before the catastrophe. The smell of home hit my nostrils as soon as I opened the front door. Familiar, homely, and simultaneously foreign, like a photograph of a place where you were once happy. I carefully placed my bag on the hallway floor. From the kitchen came the familiar clinking of dishes. Sarah was preparing dinner. "I'm home," I said, and my own voice seemed inappropriate to me, like laughter at a funeral. 2 years ago, Sarah would have met me at the door with a smile, maybe with a glass of something cold after a long day. She would have kissed me, asked how my day went. Now between us was a cold, viscous space filled with unspoken accusations and unshed tears. I walked into the kitchen. Sarah stood with her back to me, mechanically cutting vegetables. Her dark hair was pulled into a tight bun, her shoulders tense. Once I understood her every movement, could read her mood from the tilt of her head. Now a stranger stood before me. "Hi, Sarah." The knife paused for a moment. She didn't turn around. "Dinner will be ready in half an hour." I wanted to say so much. About meeting with Paul Harris, our old friend and business partner. About the charter flight he had offered me, dangerous but well paid. About how that money could help us with college tuition for Michael and Emily. About how I missed her, missed us. But the words got stuck in my throat. In this house, we had forgotten how to talk to each other the moment Ethan's small coffin was lowered into the ground. "I'll go say hello to the kids," I said instead of the thousand unspoken words. Going up the stairs, I heard music coming from Emily's room, heavy, with deep bass that drowned out the melody. The door was closed, and I knew knocking was pointless. Over the past few months, my 17-year-old daughter had turned into a ghost who existed in a parallel reality, intersecting with mine only during inevitable encounters at the dinner table. I knocked quietly on Michael's door. Unlike his sister, my 19-year-old son still talked to me. "Come in, Dad." Michael was sitting at his desk, surrounded by textbooks and printouts. His hair, as dark as Sarah's but with light strands that I had passed to him genetically, was cut short. He was preparing to enter the Air Force Academy, having decided to follow in my footsteps. Sometimes it seemed to me that this was his way of holding onto something from our previous life. "How's it going?" I asked, sitting on the edge of his bed. "Not bad. Professor Jenkins said my chances for a scholarship have increased." "That's great news, son." Michael smiled, restrainedly, like an adult. Sometimes I saw myself at his age in him, but I was never that serious. War and his brother's death had forced him to grow up too quickly. "How was the meeting with Mr. Harris?" he asked, putting down his pencil. "Did he talk about a new contract?" I nodded. Michael was the only one in the family who took an interest in my work. He offered a charter flight, transporting private cargo across the Caribbean. The pay is substantial. But Michael had always been able to read between the lines. I sighed. "The route is difficult, passes over territories where there's no radio contact, and the client wished to remain anonymous, which is unusual." "Did you agree?" I met his gaze, direct, attentive. In his eyes I saw the question he didn't dare to ask. "Is it worth it?" "I don't know, son. The money would come in handy, for you, for Emily." Dinner passed in habitual silence, interrupted only by the sound of forks against plates. Emily appeared exactly at the start, not looking at me, and just picked at her food without saying a word. Her thin face was gaunt, with shadows under her eyes. She used to be Daddy's little girl. Now every time she looked at me, she only saw the man who was responsible for her younger brother's death. I decided to tell them about Paul's offer only when Michael started helping Sarah clear the table. "Paul offered me a contract. A charter flight," I said, trying to make my voice sound neutral. Sarah froze, holding a stack of plates, her back tensed like a string. "The pay is good. It will help with college for the kids." She turned slowly. In her eyes, once so warm and understanding, there was now only cold fury. "Isn't having one death on your conscience enough? Do you want Michael and Emily to become complete orphans?" The words hit like a slap. Michael jumped up. "Mom!" "No, let him answer." Sarah didn't take her eyes off me. "You put yourself at risk to run away again, like in the army, always like this." "Sarah, I'm doing this for the family." I tried to speak calmly, though everything inside me was boiling. "For the family. You don't care about this family. You've already destroyed it. She threw the plates on the table with such force that one of them cracked. A shard flew off and left a thin red line on her palm. Sarah didn't even notice. There was something else in her eyes besides anger, something foreign, unfamiliar, as if I was looking at a person I had never known. I don't need your money, John. I needed you to be a good father to our children, at least for those you didn't kill with your irresponsibility. A choked sob came from Emily's direction. She abruptly stood up and ran out of the room. Michael stood frozen in indecision between us, torn between loyalty to his mother and father. Go after your sister, I said quietly to him. When he left, Sarah and I remained alone, separated by the table and an invisible abyss the size of a child's grave. I'll take this contract, I finally said. Not because of the money, because I need something to do, otherwise I'll just break. You're already broken, John, she replied without emotion, and you broke all of us along with yourself. I left the kitchen, feeling physical pain where my heart once was. In the bedroom, which we now occupied in turns, I slept there when she worked the night shift. I took out my phone and called Paul. I agree, I said when he answered. When is the flight? In 3 days, Paul's voice sounded pleased. You won't regret it, John. This is a new beginning for you. As it turned out later, he had no idea how right he was. Suspicious details. The next morning, I left the house earlier than usual. Sarah was still asleep, or pretending to be asleep to avoid running into me. I left a note on the kitchen table. We'll be at the hangar, back for dinner. The brevity of civilian death notices. The cold morning air cleared my head somewhat. After a sleepless night spent replaying every word from yesterday's argument in my head, I needed something precise, concrete. The airplane, mechanics, physical laws that don't change with human emotions. In the airline office, a small one-story building next to the hangars, I requested documents for the upcoming flight. Susie, our dispatcher, handed me the folder with her usual smile. Are you sure you want to take this, John? The route is difficult. I need the money, Suze, for the kids. She nodded with understanding. Everyone here knew about my tragedy. Small towns don't know how to keep secrets. I was reviewing the papers when strange details caught my attention. The route had been changed at the last moment. Now it passed through airspace over remote areas of the Caribbean coast, where radio communication was practically non-existent. The cargo was marked as technical equipment, without specifications. The client, an anonymous company registered offshore. This was all atypical, not illegal. I had transported similar cargo before, especially for private research companies. But something was scratching at my consciousness, like a splinter under the skin. When my phone rang, I flinched. Sarah's number. She had barely called me in recent months. Yes. Silence, then rapid breathing. Sarah. I heard her voice, but not speaking to me. She was talking to someone in the room. Don't understand why we need to risk so much. What if the plan doesn't work? A male voice replied something, but I couldn't make out the words. Yes, all right, Sarah's voice again, tense, uncertain. No, Ray, I'm sure I want this. Just be careful. Ray Mackenzie, our chief mechanic. The call ended. Sarah clearly didn't realize that the phone had connected to mine. An accidental pocket dial, it happens, but the words I heard. I set aside the documents and headed straight to the hangar. Ray was tinkering with the engine of a small two-seater Piper. Seeing me, he straightened up too abruptly. On his face for a moment flashed an expression I knew well. It's the look people have when suddenly confronted with someone they don't want to see. John wasn't expecting you today. His hands, usually confident and precise, were now nervously wiping oil with a rag. Ray was an excellent mechanic. We had worked together for 3 years. He had come to our town after several years at a major airline. Tired of corporate hassle, he explained. We were never close friends, but I trusted his work, until this moment. Is the plane ready for the charter? I asked in a neutral tone. Of course, though I don't understand why you're taking this crappy assignment, John. The route sucks, the cargo unknown. That's exactly why I need to know the plane is in order. He nodded too hastily. Everything's fine, as always. I personally checked every system. I believed him, once believed him, but his nervousness, Sarah's strange conversation, changes to the route. Too many coincidences for a former Special Forces operative. Show me the aircraft, Ray. His Adam's apple jerked. It's in the far hangar, on final check. Let's go together. We walked across the airfield in silence. I could feel almost palpable tension emanating from Ray. His gaze darted around, as if looking for escape routes. Several times he started to speak but fell silent without saying a word. Are you having problems, Ray? I finally asked. He stumbled, though the path was completely flat. No, what makes you think that? Just a lot of work and personal issues, nothing serious. You were talking to my wife today. It was a shot in the dark, but Ray's reaction confirmed my suspicions. His face paled, his eyes widened in panic. What? No, we just. Just what, Ray? He swallowed, avoiding my gaze. Just doing my job as always. We reached the hangar. The Cessna stood there, snow-white, elegant, with thin blue stripes along the sides, an experimental model designed for long-distance flights with minimal fuel consumption. I ran my hand over the smooth fuselage. I'll check it myself, Ray, from start to finish, every system. Suit yourself, he mumbled. I just need to, I have another plane. He practically ran out of the hangar, leaving me alone with the aircraft, and a growing suspicion that I had gotten into something much more dangerous than just a risky charter flight. In the evening, I tried to talk to Sarah about Ray's strange behavior. She was sitting in the living room, reviewing some documents. Still the same tight bun of hair, still the same tense line of shoulders. Do you know Ray Mackenzie? I began, sitting down in the chair opposite her. She didn't even look up. The mechanic, seen him a couple of times at company events. He called you today. Now she looked at me. In her eyes was not fear, not guilt, but cold irritation. And now you're monitoring my calls. Delightful, John. No, I overheard by accident. You dialed me without knowing. You're delusional, she shook her head. PTSD flaring up again, seeing spies and conspiracies. Her words hit the mark precisely. Military psychologists know where to strike. Sarah, what's going on? Ray is acting strangely. The flight documents changed at the last moment. Listen to yourself, she interrupted me in a harsh tone. You see enemies where there are none and you don't notice your own mistakes. That's why we're here, John. That's why Ethan is dead. I stood up, feeling everything inside me constrict. Sarah had always been my support, the person who helped me return from the war that continued in my head. Now she was using that same knowledge to destroy me. What happened to you, Sarah? I asked quietly. This isn't you. For a moment something flickered in her eyes, fear, regret, but it immediately disappeared, replaced by her usual coldness. I just saw you as you are, John, as you've always been. She returned to her documents, showing that the conversation was over. I went to the bedroom, where I again spent a sleepless night, sifting through the oddities of the last few days and wondering if I was right in my paranoia. Preparation for flight. Dawn found me already in the hangar. The last 2 days I had spent methodically checking every system of the airplane. I had found nothing suspicious, but the worm of doubt continued to gnaw from inside. Mr. Riley, a young technician, whose name I couldn't remember, handed me a folder. Final documents for your flight. Mr. Harris asked to deliver them personally. I looked through the papers. The same oddities, anonymous cargo, altered route. But now I noticed another detail. The backup airfield for emergency landing had been changed from Miami to a small private airport deep within the continent, significantly farther from the main route. Another coincidence, they were becoming too many. I climbed into the cockpit to check the navigation system once more when my phone rang. Emily's name on the screen made my heart jump. She had barely called me since Ethan's funeral. "Emily, sweetheart." "Dad," her voice sounded strange, as if she wasn't sure whether to call. "Are you okay?" "Of course, honey, getting ready for the flight." Pause. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. "Be careful, Dad." "Always, sweetie." Another pause, then. "I had a strange dream last night. You were falling in an airplane, and no one could find you." A chill ran down my spine. For a second I felt an irrational fear akin to superstition. In Iraq, we believed in such omens. Too often they came true. "It was just a dream, Emily." "Yes, just take care of yourself, okay?" "I promise." She hung up before I could tell her how much I loved her. The call left a strange feeling behind. This was the first sign of care from her in months, and it sounded like a warning. I returned to the inspection but couldn't concentrate. My thoughts kept returning to Sarah and Ray's conversation, to the strange route, to Emily's premonition. Something was coming together into a complete picture, but the details were slipping away. When the phone rang again, I expected anything but Michael's name on the screen. A second call from my children in one day. This was a record for the past few months. "Michael." "Dad, I found something important about the accident with Ethan." His voice sounded tense, with that pulsating urgency I remembered from Iraq. That's how people talk about a planted bomb, an ambush, something deadly dangerous. "What do you mean?" "The forensic report. There are inconsistencies, the breaks were." The connection suddenly cut off. I tried to call back, but Michael's phone was unavailable. I dialed the home number. No one answered. Anxiety was growing, turning into an almost physical sensation of danger. A text message came when I was already preparing to leave the hangar and rush home. "Dad, I'm fine, just phone battery died. Be extremely careful. Don't trust P." Paul, but why should Michael not trust Paul? They had always gotten along well. After Ethan's death, Paul was one of the few who supported our family, especially Sarah. He helped with the funeral, with legal issues, even with psychological support for the children. I tried to call again, but without success. The departure time was approaching, and the feeling that something was catastrophically wrong only intensified. "Mr. Riley, everything's ready for takeoff." The young technician looked into the cockpit. "Weather's perfect." I should have postponed the flight. Gone home, talked to Michael, figured out this situation. But if I refused the contract now, the money would be gone. Money that could have secured college for Michael and Emily, given them a chance at the future that Ethan deserved as well. "Thanks, I'll be ready in 5 minutes." Discovery of sabotage. "Sierra Alpha 17, you've reached cruising altitude. Happy flight." The controller's voice was the last thing I heard before the radio sank into the emptiness of white noise. According to the plan, I was entering a zone where communication would be restored only after an hour of flight. At 30,000 feet, the world seems amazingly simple. White clouds below, endless blue above. The horizon, curved so that it reminds you of the Earth's spherical shape. The cabin is quiet, only the measured hum of engines interrupting the silence. That's why I noticed the slight change in the sound of the hydraulic system almost immediately. Not a malfunction, not a failure, just a small change in tone that an ordinary passenger would never catch. But for a test pilot, it was like hearing a false note in a symphony. I checked the instrument readings. The pressure in the main hydraulic system was within normal limits, but I frowned. It was falling. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, but steadily. Not fast enough to trigger the emergency alarm, but at this rate of leakage, within an hour or two, the pressure would drop to a critical level. I switched to the backup system and ran diagnostics. The readings stubbornly indicated a leak somewhere in the main line. But where? And most importantly, why? The memory of Michael's message about the brakes in Ethan's car surfaced. Could it be? I opened the technical log, checking the last maintenance record. Everything was in order, Ray's signature in place. But if he had done something to the system after the official inspection? I turned on the radio, trying to contact any available control point. Silence. Either I was still too far away, or the radio had been deliberately disabled. The pressure continued to fall, now faster than I had expected, as if something had completely lost pressure. I physically felt the controls becoming less responsive. The ailerons reacted with a delay, the elevator required more effort. I switched to the emergency manual system, but it also wasn't working as it should. Someone had thought everything through very carefully. The damage was calculated so that the failure would occur precisely here, over impenetrable jungle, with no way to contact controllers. A realization flashed in my mind. The same precise calculation as in that car accident where Ethan died. Brakes, hydraulics, the same principles, different systems, and the same result, a fatal accident that should look like an accident or pilot error. The instrument panel began flashing red warning lights when the pressure dropped to a critical level. The plane began to tilt to the left, slowly entering a spiral. This was not a coincidence, not an accident. Someone wanted me dead, and apparently the same someone was behind Ethan's death. "Survive, Riley," I whispered aloud. "Prove you're not guilty." But even my military experience and pilot skills couldn't fix what was already broken. I could only delay the inevitable. The plane began to fall, you know the rest. I fought with the controls, trying to keep the plane in a relatively level position. Without hydraulics, the controls were heavy, the system's response delayed. Like lifting weights underwater, resisting the current. In Iraq, we were taught, if you find yourself in a no-win situation, choose how to die. I didn't want to die. I had children who, despite all our problems, needed me. I had a truth that needed to be revealed. I pointed the nose of the plane toward the river, fighting the increasing speed of the fall. The machine creaked and groaned, resisting my efforts like a living being unwilling to obey. I closed my eyes before the impact, but not out of fear. My mind filled with faces. Michael serious, with eyes full of quiet wisdom. Emily, once sunny and bright, now locked in her grief. Ethan, whom I couldn't protect. Sarah, the Sarah I loved and who had been my anchor before turning into a stranger with cold eyes. I couldn't fail them, not again. The first impact was deafening. The treetops struck the fuselage like giant green waves. Metal screeched, tearing. The cockpit glass cracked but, surprisingly, didn't completely shatter. The second impact was stronger. The plane fully entered the canopy of trees. I felt something sharp pierce my side, a fragment of the instrument panel or fuselage debris. The pain was so intense that, for a moment, the world turned white before my eyes. The third impact I barely remember. The plane spun and the instrument panel rushed toward me. I felt my ribs breaking from the collision. The air was knocked out of my lungs. The taste of blood filled my mouth. The last thing I remembered before the world plunged into darkness was a strange sensation. I was not dying. Somehow, against all odds, I had managed to survive the crash. Through foggy consciousness, I saw someone approaching the broken cockpit. A tall, bearded man with a medical bag. His eyes, surprised but determined. "Hold on, you're badly injured," I heard through the blood pulsing in my ears. Darkness came suddenly like a switched-off light. My last thought pulsated in my fading consciousness. I must survive, for the children. They would not be left orphans. I wouldn't let that happen. Even if the whole world was against me, I was going to survive and find whoever was behind this. Find whoever took my son from me. Chapter 2: The Truth. Pain brought me back to life. Sharp, pulsating, it spread from my broken ribs throughout my body in waves of agony. The darkness dissipated slowly like fog over a swamp at dawn. Through the haze, I saw an unfamiliar ceiling, rough wooden beams intertwined with something metallic, twisted. Debris from my plane. The memory of the crash returned instantly. The fall, the trees, the pain, the strange figure leaning over me. I hadn't died, but I wasn't sure I had survived either. Between these states, it turns out, there exists an agonizingly long intermediate space. Rescue and isolation. Consciousness was returning in jerks, like a poorly tuned radio. I didn't know how long I had been unconscious, but the light coming through the cracks in the walls spoke of daytime. An attempt to sit up turned into a new wave of pain that darkened my vision. Not recommended, a voice said somewhere to my right. 3 broken ribs, internal bleeding, and a concussion, not the kind of injuries you should rush with. I turned my head slowly, trying not to cause a new attack of pain. On a stool next to the narrow cot sat a tall, bearded man about 60 years old. Tanned face with deep wrinkles, long gray hair tied in a ponytail. His hands, neat, with long fingers, held a bandage he had just removed from my chest. "Who are you?" My voice was as rough as sandpaper on wood. "I think it would be more appropriate to ask you that question." He lowered the bandage into a bowl with some herbal liquid. "It's not every day people fall from the sky into my part of the jungle, but I can introduce myself. Thomas Shepard, hermit by force of circumstance, doctor by education, and now, evidently, your savior." "John Riley, pilot," each word was difficult. "My plane. Most of it is scattered across the jungle within a half-mile radius," Thomas interrupted me. "What could be useful I brought here. The rest will be reclaimed by nature." He applied a fresh bandage to my chest. His movements were precise, measured, how professionals act, having performed the same procedure thousands of times. "How long have I been here?" 2 weeks, he replied, not raising his eyes from his work. "You've been fighting for your life most of that time. Fever, infection, bleeding. I lost you twice and brought you back twice. If you're a believer, you can thank your God for resilience. If not, thank evolution for your sturdy constitution." 2 weeks, my family must think I'm dead. Michael, Emily, even Sarah. Despite all our problems, the news of my death would have caused them pain. "I need to contact my family." I tried to sit up again, ignoring the pain. "Is there a phone, radio?" Thomas's face changed. A slight crease between his eyebrows, barely noticeable tension in the corners of his mouth. "I'm afraid that's impossible." "What do you mean, impossible? They think I'm dead." "Perhaps it's better they continue to think so." These words sounded like a slap. I grabbed his wrist, despite the pain that shot through my ribs. "What the hell does that mean?" Thomas didn't try to free himself. He just looked at me with a strange expression, a mixture of compassion and wariness. "Your plane was sabotaged, Mr. Riley. I've seen enough accidents to distinguish a mechanical failure from deliberate damage. Someone very much wanted you not to return from this flight." A chill ran down my spine. I released his hand. "So I was right." "About what?" "Before the crash, I noticed signs of sabotage. The hydraulics were damaged too, professionally." Thomas nodded, as if I had confirmed his own conclusions. "As soon as you contact the outside world, whoever organized the accident will learn you survived and finish the job." "How do you know about this? How do you have so much information about what happened?" For the first time in our conversation, Thomas averted his eyes. He stood up, went to a roughly constructed cabinet and took out some pills. "Take these for the pain." I began, but he interrupted. "I heard, and I'll answer, but not now. Right now you need rest. As soon as you're strong enough to hear the full story, I'll tell you everything I know." I wanted to insist, but my body betrayed me. A wave of weakness overwhelmed me, and I realized I was exhausted even by this short conversation. My eyes were closing on their own. As soon as you call, they will come for you, and for me was the last thing I heard before sinking back into darkness. Find out who I am. I can't allow that. The next few days passed in a semi-conscious state. I would wake up, take the food Thomas brought, mostly soups and broths from local plants, and then fall back asleep. Gradually, the periods of wakefulness became longer. I began to notice details of my shelter, a hut, partly built of wood, partly from the wreckage of my plane. Sunlight penetrated through cracks in the walls, drawing intricate patterns on the earthen floor. Thomas avoided conversations about his past and how he ended up in the jungle. It was obvious that his medical education was genuine. He knew what he was doing when treating my wounds and administering medications. He spoke about the world around with the erudition of a man who had once been part of civilization. But each time I tried to find out details, he changed the subject or simply walked away. On the 5th day of my conscious stay in the hut, I made my first attempt to stand. My legs folded like cotton, and I collapsed to my knees, gasping from the pain in my ribs. "I told you," Thomas helped me back to the bed. "You won't go anywhere for at least a week." But the next day I tried again, and the day after. Little by little, overcoming weakness and pain, I began to regain control over my own body. Thomas observed my efforts with restrained approval, sometimes giving advice on how to move to minimize strain on my ribs. During this time, a strange trust began to form between us. He was my savior, but also my jailer, a man who wouldn't let me contact the world. I didn't know his story, but I felt that behind his hermitage stood something more than a simple desire for solitude. As I recovered, I began helping with simple tasks around the hut, chopping wood, at first with difficulty, then more confidently, preparing food, fixing the roof damaged by a recent storm. Each action returned me to life, reminding me of who I was before the accident. At night I was haunted by nightmares. I saw the falling plane but couldn't control it. I saw my children's faces clouded with grief. And Sarah, not as she had become after Ethan's death, but as she used to be, with warmth in her eyes and a slight smile. I would wake up in a cold sweat, gasping for unspoken words. One morning, as we were having breakfast with fish caught by Thomas, I decided it was time to demand answers. "Who are you really?" I asked directly, "and why are you hiding here?" Thomas watched our reunion silently for a long time, as if assessing whether I was ready to hear the truth. "Someone who screwed up," he finally replied. "Like many others, but my mistakes cost a person their life." He didn't continue, and I didn't push. This was the first step toward trust, which we both had to earn. Death. Meanwhile in town, as I later learned from Michael, events unfolded as follows. The Church of St. Joseph was filled to capacity. Most residents of the small town had come to say goodbye to John Riley, war hero, pilot, father, whom many knew personally, and the rest through stories. In the first row sat Sarah, dressed in a simple black dress, her face frozen in a mask of calm acceptance. Next to her, Emily, quietly crying, and Michael, with the stone expression of a man who wouldn't allow himself to break. On the other side of Sarah sat Paul Harris, his hand on her shoulder in a gesture of support that seemed simultaneously intimate and possessive. The search operation had been officially terminated 5 days after the plane's disappearance. The wreckage wasn't found, no body was discovered, but the chances of survival in a crash in dense tropical jungle were practically non-existent, especially after a strong storm had flooded the lowlands and washed away possible traces of the accident. The choir finished a hymn and Paul approached the lectern. His dark suit was impeccable, as always, his expression, the perfect combination of grief and dignity. "John Riley was not just my business partner but my best friend," he began, scanning the gathered crowd. A man of honor and duty who never retreated in the face of danger. First in war, where he defended our country, then in the sky, where he tested machines that expanded the boundaries of the possible. Sarah stared straight ahead, not blinking. Her breathing was even, too even, as if controlled by an effort of will. Michael shifted his gaze from her to Paul and back, with a barely noticeable crease between his eyebrows. In these difficult times, I promised to take care of John's family as he would have wanted, Paul continued, now looking directly at Sarah. About financial matters, about the children, about you, Sarah. John often told me how worried he was about your future if something happened to him. I won't let him down. In the back rows of the church sat Ray Mackenzie, the mechanic. His eyes were red, either from tears or alcohol, the smell of which could be detected even at a distance. He nervously fidgeted with the service program, tearing it along the edges. After the ceremony, people slowly dispersed, stopping to express condolences to the family. Michael noticed Ray hurriedly heading toward the exit, avoiding meeting them. Something in his behavior, jerky movements, downcast gaze, ignited a spark of suspicion that had been smoldering in Michael since the day news of the plane crash arrived. "Mr. Mackenzie," he called out to the mechanic, moving away from his mother and sister, "can I ask you a question?" Ray stopped, clenching his fists. Slowly, as if overcoming himself, he turned to Michael. "Of course, kid." His voice was hoarse, unusually loud for a church yard. "What do you want to know?" "About my father's last flight. You conducted the technical inspection of the plane. Was there anything unusual? Any problems with the machine?" Ray's face contorted as if in pain. "Why such questions? Think I didn't do my job well? Think it's my fault?" "I'm just trying to understand what happened." Michael was surprised by such a reaction. "Dad talked to me about the flight before departure. He was worried." "Leave me alone," Ray almost shouted, attracting the attention of those around. "I don't know anything, nothing." Paul appeared beside them, as if by magic. His hand fell on Ray's shoulder, squeezing slightly harder than necessary for a friendly gesture. "Ray, you're upset. We're all upset." His voice was soft, but his eyes were cold. "Maybe you should go home and rest." Ray nodded, suddenly becoming obedient as a child. "Yes, yes, you're right, I'll go." He cast one last glance at Michael, a strange mixture of guilt and fear, and quickly left, almost fled from the church yard. "Don't pay attention, Michael," Paul smiled gently. "Ray is taking it hard. He and your father worked together for many years." "3 years," Michael corrected automatically. "Not that many." "Enough to become attached," Paul directed Michael back towards Sarah and Emily. "Come, your mother needs you now." But Michael noticed the quick glance exchanged between Paul and Ray before the mechanic left. A look that contained neither sadness nor sympathy, only cold understanding. After the memorial service, Paul gathered the Riley family in his spacious house on the outskirts of town. Officially, for a memorial dinner in a small circle. In reality, to discuss practical matters. "I've contacted the insurance company," he was saying, sitting at the head of the table with a glass of whiskey. "As soon as all the formalities are completed, you'll receive the first payment." John was a prudent man. He took out a very good insurance policy. "I didn't know," Sarah said quietly, looking at her untouched glass. "He never discussed such things with me." "He wanted to protect you, dear." Paul covered her hand with his. "John was always like that, trying to handle everything alone, carry all the burden on his shoulders." Michael observed their interaction with growing concern. His mother's strange detachment, Paul's casual familiarity, and surprisingly deep knowledge of their family's financial affairs. "Mr. Harris," he began, "you mentioned the contract you offered my father. What kind of flight was it?" Paul looked at him with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "A routine charter, Michael. Equipment transportation across the Caribbean Sea. Your father was the best pilot for such work." Then why was the route changed at the last moment? Why did Dad tell me something was wrong? Silence fell over the table. Emily shifted her gaze from her brother to Paul. Sarah froze, still looking at her glass. Your father was under pressure, Paul said carefully. After what happened with Ethan, well, you know, his psychological state was unstable. My father wasn't crazy. Michael, Sarah finally looked up. Don't talk to Paul like that. He's only trying to help. Her eyes were strangely empty, her pupils dilated more than they should be in a brightly lit room. Michael suddenly remembered his father's last message. Don't trust P. Sorry, he said, not feeling an ounce of remorse. I'm just trying to understand what happened. It was an accident, Michael. Paul's voice was soft, almost hypnotic. Sometimes we just need to accept it and move on. But Michael wasn't ready to accept and move on. Not when every instinct was screaming that something was wrong here. Michael's suspicions. Alex Murphy hadn't changed since the last time Michael saw him, at Ethan's funeral. The same faded jeans, worn leather jacket, penetrating eyes of a man accustomed to noticing details. The only difference, the cane he leaned on, entering the cafe where they had arranged to meet. The consequence of an injury in Iraq, received in the very battle where John Riley had saved his life. Michael, Alex extended his hand for a firm handshake. You've grown. It's been almost 2 years, Mr. Murphy. Call me Alex, for God's sake. Mr. Murphy is my father. They settled at a table in the corner, where their conversation couldn't be overheard. Alex ordered coffee for himself and a milkshake for Michael, eliciting an involuntary smile from the latter. He remembered what Michael had loved as a child. Good that you called, Alex began after the waitress walked away. I was going to contact you myself when I heard about your father. You don't believe it was an accident, not a question, a statement. Alex looked attentively at Michael, as if reassessing him. Why do you think that? Because I don't believe it either. I don't trust Paul. Paul Harris. Michael nodded. You understand that you're accusing the man who's currently supporting your family, who organized the funeral, is handling the insurance, supporting your mother. I'm not accusing anything. Yet, Michael took a folder out of his backpack. I just want you to look at this. He laid out printouts on the table, technical data with spreadsheets and graphs. What is this? Data from the onboard system of the car in which Ethan died when Dad was driving. I was working on a school project about automotive diagnostics and got access to the insurance company's archives. I was studying accidents for statistics and found a report on ours. Alex put on reading glasses and carefully reviewed the documents. And where did you get the report on your father's plane? From a friend of Dad's at the airline. He gave me a copy of the commission's preliminary findings. Alex shifted his gaze from one document to another, his face becoming increasingly grim. The braking system in the car was damaged in exactly the same way as the hydraulics in your father's plane, he finally said, removing his glasses. The same principle, not a sudden failure but a gradual, calculated leak, which leads to complete loss of control at the most inopportune moment. He leaned back in his chair, looking at Michael with new respect. This is no coincidence. This is the handwriting of a professional, someone who understands both cars and planes, someone with access to both vehicles. Ray Mackenzie, Michael pronounced. The mechanic, possibly, but he doesn't seem like a man who plans such things, more like an executor. Then who's the planner, Paul? Alex drummed his fingers on the table, considering the situation. What do you know about Paul Harris's past, about how he met your parents? He and Dad were business partners, aviation business. They met when Mom was conducting psychological assessments for a military contract. Your mother assessed Paul. Michael thought, trying to remember. I'm not sure, I think so. She worked with the whole team. Alex made a note in his notebook. Interesting. And when did Paul start showing special interest in your family? What was his interaction with you like before Ethan's death? He was always around. Uncle Paul, that's what we called him, but after the accident, he became practically a family member, especially for Mom. And your father, how did he feel about this friendship? Fine, I think, at least until Ethan's death, Michael swallowed. After that, everything changed. Parents grew apart. Mom blamed Dad for the accident. And Paul supported Mom, said Dad was careless, that his military experience made him reckless, risk-taking, that he was driving recklessly, and that's the result, my brother's death. Alex closed his notebook and looked intently at Michael. I need to gather more information about Paul Harris, about his past, connections, finances. If he's truly behind these accidents, there must be a reason. I think the reason is my mother, Michael said quietly. He looks at her the way Dad looked when they first met. Alex nodded, not looking surprised. Classic scenario. Eliminate the rival, comfort the widow, become a hero to the orphan children. What are we going to do? First, we'll be careful. If Paul truly organized two accidents, he won't stop at anything. Second, we'll gather evidence. I'm particularly interested in the connection between Paul and the mechanic Ray. And third, we'll find out what's happening with your mother. Her behavior, from your description, is atypical even for a grieving person. Michael felt simultaneous relief and fear. Relief that he wasn't alone in his suspicions, and fear of what they might discover. Thank you, Alex. Don't thank me, thank your father. Alex finished his coffee. He pulled me out of the line of fire in Iraq. I'll always be in his debt. He fell silent, looking out the window at passing cars. And one more thing, Michael. I'm not convinced your father is dead. What? The chances are slim, but your father is the most resilient man I've ever known. If anyone could survive that crash, it's him. Thomas's revelation. By the end of my second week of conscious stay in Thomas's hut, I could move without assistance. The pain in my ribs still made itself known with sudden movements, but overall I felt like a human being, not a helpless invalid. I began exploring the surroundings, first not far from the hut, then expanding the circle. The jungle was dense, humid, filled with sounds and smells. Sometimes I thought I heard the distant hum of an airplane or helicopter engine, but the sound always disappeared before I could determine its direction. Thomas gave me a machete for cutting paths and instructed me not to go beyond the sound of a stream flowing nearby. If you get lost, I won't find you, but local predators will, he warned with a half-smile, which I wasn't sure was a joke or not. During one such exploratory trip, I came across a strange path that seemed more well-trodden than a random passage through the jungle. Following it, I came to a small hill where I discovered a camouflaged entrance to a cave. Natural curiosity, enhanced by months of inactivity and the strange circumstances of my rescue, made me look inside. The cave was shallow but dry. In the far corner stood a military-grade metal container, waterproof, with a secure lock. My lock-picking skills, acquired in the Special Forces, didn't fail me. The lock clicked after a few minutes of manipulation. Inside, I found neatly stacked folders with newspaper clippings, news printouts, photographs. Most clippings concerned business news, company mergers, new contracts, executive appointments. But my attention was drawn to a stack of materials tied with a red thread. Untying it, I saw a photograph that made my blood freeze. In it were Paul Harris, my wife Sarah, and myself at a military reception 5 years ago. Next to it lay a medical report titled Psychological Assessment, Paul Harris, with Sarah's signature. I began reading, and with each page my suspicions grew into certainty. Sarah had conducted an assessment of Paul for a military contract and discovered disturbing traits: lack of empathy, manipulative behavior, hidden aggression. He's a damn psychopath. but due to lack of clear evidence and probably personal sympathy toward Paul, she had limited herself to minimal remarks in the official report. Other documents linked Paul to the mysterious death of a patient in a clinic where a certain Dr. Thomas Shepard worked. The case was closed when Dr. Shepard disappeared, indirectly admitting his guilt in medical negligence. I was sitting in the cave, surrounded by these revelations, when I heard a voice behind me. "Found anything interesting?" I turned sharply. Thomas stood at the entrance, leaning on a rifle, not aiming at me but not hiding the weapon either. "Who the hell are you, and how do you know Paul Harris?" I asked, holding the photograph from the reception in my hand. Thomas sighed and lowered the rifle. "I suppose now I'll have to tell the whole story." We returned to the hut. Thomas lit a fire in the hearth and took out a bottle with amber liquid, moonshine from local fruits, as he explained. Pouring for both of us, he began his story. "I was a successful surgeon in Boston, specialized in trauma surgery, saved many lives. Among my patients was a man named James Lockhart, a businessman who had suffered a serious car accident. During his treatment, I noticed strange visits, a man who introduced himself as a business partner but behaved unusually, too interested in medications, too often left alone with the patient. This man was Paul Harris." Thomas took a sip from his cup and continued. "Lockhart began showing strange symptoms: disorientation, paranoia, fear. I suspected poisoning or incorrect medication dosage. I started an investigation but didn't have time to finish it. Lockhart died of cardiac arrest. The autopsy showed an unusual combination of substances in his blood, not lethal individually, but fatal in combination." "You accused Paul?" I asked. "Tried to, but the evidence was circumstantial, and a week later I was accused of medical negligence. Allegedly, I had prescribed the wrong treatment to another patient. The evidence was fabricated but flawless. I was facing not only the end of my career but a prison sentence. I fled, but I decided not to leave everything unpunished." He took a photograph from a desk drawer, the same one from the military reception, but with a wider frame, including himself in the background. "This was the first meeting between Paul and your wife in a professional capacity. She was conducting psychological assessments for a military contract. I was there as a medical consultant, and I saw how he looked at her, not with admiration or desire, with obsession. Sarah was the first person who saw right through him. Her official report was restrained, but when we discussed the assessment results in private, she expressed serious concerns about his psychological profile. But she continued to communicate with him. They became friends. I couldn't understand how this fit together. That's the genius of Paul. He turned a threat into his advantage. You see, when someone recognizes you, you have two choices: eliminate them or make them your ally. Sarah was too valuable to simply eliminate. He began a long campaign to seduce her, ingratiating himself, becoming closer to your family." "But why? Why this elaborate scheme?" Thomas looked at me with such sympathy that my heart constricted. "I think initially it was just interest. She saw his true self and wasn't afraid. That's rare for someone like Paul, but over time it turned into an obsession. He wanted her, and he saw you as an obstacle." "Ethan," I said quietly, "the accident wasn't accidental. It was certainly orchestrated by Paul. That's the perfect way to create a rift in your marriage, a tragedy in which you can be directly blamed. Sarah grows distant, you're broken, and there's Paul becoming the comforter, the support, the family's new protector." I remembered the last months before my final flight. Sarah's coldness, her accusations, the strange detachment that seemed more like a trance than grief, and Paul's constant presence beside her. "He's doing something to her, some kind of drugs possibly. She was, not herself." Thomas nodded. "That's his method. He did the same with Lockhart. Combinations of substances that alter perception, memory, emotional responses. Not lethal doses, not causing obvious symptoms of poisoning, just behavioral adjustments. And my plane, why kill me if he already had control over Sarah? Insurance, power, final elimination of a rival, and perhaps most importantly, completion of the narrative. You don't just disappear from Sarah's life, you become a tragic figure whose image he can control. The widow of a hero who died just like her son. There's a cruel poetic symmetry in that which someone like Paul would appreciate. We sat silently, looking at the fire. The puzzle in my head finally came together into a clear, terrifying picture. I need to go back, I said finally. Save my family. If you just show up, he'll have time to cover his tracks, destroy evidence, paint you as insane, even harm your children to blackmail you. Paul is a predator, and a cornered predator is especially dangerous. What do you suggest? We need a strategy, evidence, and allies we can trust. Ray's confession. Meanwhile in town. As Michael later told me, events unfolded as follows. Ray Mackenzie is our weak link, Alex was saying, looking through a folder of collected information. He's a mechanic, had access to both the plane and, probably, your father's car. And judging by your description of his behavior at the funeral, he's clearly hiding something. How do we make him talk? Asked Michael. We won't make him. We'll give him an opportunity. They were sitting in Alex's worn-out van, parked across from Jack's Bar, a favorite spot for local mechanics and workers. It was almost 9 in the evening, and Ray should appear any minute if his habits hadn't changed. He drinks every evening after work, Alex explained. An alcoholic with a guilty conscience, the most predictable person in the world. As if on cue, Ray appeared on the street, heading toward the bar. His gait was already slightly uneven. Obviously, he had started the evening earlier. I'll follow him, said Michael, opening the van door. You're too noticeable. Be careful. Alex handed him a small device the size of a lighter. Hidden camera with microphone. Try not to let him notice. Michael nodded and headed toward the bar. Inside, it was noisy, smoky, country music playing from an ancient jukebox. Ray had already taken a seat at the counter and was ordering, judging by his gestures, something strong. Michael took a place next to him, pretending to have just noticed the mechanic. Mr. Mackenzie, what a coincidence. Ray flinched and turned, clutching a glass of whiskey that had just been served. Michael, what are you? You're not even 21. He looked around as if expecting the police to appear. I'm 19 and I came to drink cola. Michael smiled at the bartender and ordered a non-alcoholic drink. Tough day for all of us. Ray nodded, relaxing. He downed the whiskey in one gulp and gestured for another. Yeah, tough day. This whole story with your father. You worked with him for a long time. 3 years. He was a good man. A real professional. Ray fell silent, looking into his glass. Didn't deserve this. Deserve what? Ray looked up, suddenly wary. The accident, of course. What else? I don't know, you tell me. The mechanic turned away, pretending to be interested in the television showing a baseball game. Nothing to talk about. Michael took a sip of cola, pausing. Then he said quietly, almost in a whisper, I know what happened to the hydraulics, Mr. Mackenzie, and to the brakes in the car where my brother died. The same signature. Ray's hand trembled, whiskey spilling on the counter. The bartender tossed them a clean cloth. You're delirious, kid. Go home. The police might not notice the coincidences, but I noticed, and others too. Soon there will be an official investigation. This was a bluff, but Ray, already drunk enough and tormented by guilt, swallowed the bait. Don't get involved in this, Michael. He grabbed the young man's arm, looking around to see if anyone could hear their conversation. It's dangerous, for you, for your family. My father and brother are already dead. What could be worse? Ray released his arm and dropped his head to his chest. I'm sorry about your father, kid. I didn't know it would go so far. He said it was just for insurance. Who said? You know who, Ray took another sip. He controls your mother just like he controls me. Those pills he gives her under the guise of antidepressants. They change consciousness, you understand. Make her. He twirled his finger near his temple. How does he control you, Ray? The mechanic laughed bitterly. Debts, damn car debts. I owed 40,000 to a man who breaks arms for much smaller amounts. Paul helped, bought the debt, gave me time to pay, and then started demanding services. Sabotage of my father's plane. And the car, Ray nodded, no longer caring about secrecy. The brakes. Everything was supposed to look like an accident, you understand. But your brother, that was a mistake. He wasn't supposed to be in that car. Only your father was. Michael felt the blood drain from his face. His younger brother had died because of a miscalculation in the plan to murder his father. He clenched his fists tightly under the counter, restraining his fury. Why are you deciding to tell about this now? Ray finished his whiskey and smiled sadly. Because it doesn't matter anymore. I'm doomed anyway. If not Paul, then alcohol or conscience. It's eating me from the inside, you understand. Every night I see the face of your brother and your father. They look at me and know what I did. You could testify, help put Paul behind bars. No evidence, just my word against his, and he has connections, money, reputation. And if there was evidence, if we could prove he's manipulating my mother, that he organized 2 murders. Ray looked intently at Michael, sobering up visibly. Then I might find the courage, for your brother's sake, for your father's sake, but there is no such evidence. Maybe there is, Michael leaned closer. If we join forces, we'll have a chance. A week later, Michael and Alex were sitting in the same car, reviewing video of Ray's full confession, recorded in a more private setting. The mechanic had told everything about the blackmail, the precise instructions for damaging the brakes and hydraulics, about the pills he sometimes delivered from Paul to Sarah. This is enough for a warrant, said Alex, turning off the tablet. But not for conviction. We need physical evidence, pills, documents, something that directly links Paul to the crimes. And how do we get them? We need help, and possibly a miracle. The miracle happened the next day. Return from the dead. This might work, Thomas was saying, helping me restore a radio found in the wreckage of the plane. But more likely, it won't. The equipment is damaged, power will barely last for a few minutes. Should be enough to send a signal. I connected the last wire. If Alex is still using the old military frequency for his work, if he's in town, if he hears. Too many ifs, John. Do you have a better idea? Thomas shook his head. Over the past month, we had become a strange kind of friends, 2 people united by a common enemy and stories of loss. I learned more about his past, about his brilliant career in medicine, the family he left behind, the years spent in the jungle trying to find redemption for a mistake he didn't commit. When this is all over, I said, tuning the frequency, you need to go back, clear your name. Maybe, he didn't look convinced. First, let's take care of your family. I turned on the transmitter and began sending a signal, the same call signs we had used with Alex in hot zones, a security protocol known only to the 2 of us. There was no response for long hours. We were already preparing to give up when there was a crackle of static, and through the interference, a familiar voice broke through. Johnny boy, is that really you, damn it? I had never been so glad to hear Alex's voice. Alex, yes, it's me, alive. I knew it. You tough bastard, I knew you wouldn't give up so easily. Through the radio interference, I heard another voice, younger, excited. Dad, is it really you? Michael's son. My throat constricted. I hadn't expected to hear my son so soon, wasn't prepared for the wave of emotions that swept over me. Mike, is it really Dad? Michael's voice sounded simultaneously disbelieving and desperately wanting to believe. Son, do you remember what I told you before your first solo flight? A pause, then with a tremor in his voice. That the sky doesn't forgive mistakes, but always gives a second chance to those who know how to learn. Exactly, son. We spoke quickly, exchanging information through the crackling radio connection. I told them about the crash, about Thomas, about the evidence against Paul. Michael and Alex shared the information they had gathered: Ray's confession, Sarah's strange behavior, Paul's financial manipulations with my insurance. "We need to get you out of there," Alex said after we had exchanged everything we knew. "I have connections, a private helicopter, a pilot who doesn't ask questions." "When?" "2 days. Need to prepare, develop a plan. If we want to catch Paul, we'll need all the evidence Thomas has." The connection began to break up. The battery was running out. "Michael," I tried to speak quickly while there was still a chance. "How's Emily? How's Mom?" "Emily is holding up. She doesn't know I'm communicating with Alex. Mom, she's not herself, Dad. Paul is constantly with her, giving her some pills. She's like in a trance." "We'll get her out, son, I promise." "The ceremony is in 3 days." Michael's voice was breaking through the increasing interference. "What? Repeat." "Paul has announced his engagement to Mom," Michael shouted before the connection was completely lost. "The ceremony is in 3 days." The radio went silent. I looked at Thomas, feeling my blood turning to ice. "3 days," I said. "We have 3 days to stop him." At dawn on the second day, we heard the sound of an approaching helicopter. Thomas looked nervous, for the first time since I'd known him. "Are you sure this Alex can be trusted?" "With my life," I replied. "He's a former Special Forces operative like me. I pulled him out of an ambush in Iraq, took a bullet in the shoulder saving his ass." "People tend to change." "Not Alex." I put my hand on Thomas's shoulder. "You can trust him too. He'll help clear your name." The helicopter landed in a small clearing not far from the hut. Michael jumped out first, taller than I remembered, with the tense face of someone who had grown up too quickly. Behind him, leaning on a cane, came Alex, the same as ever, except with more gray in his hair. Michael froze for a moment upon seeing me, thinner, with a grown beard but alive. Then he rushed forward, embracing me with such force that my broken ribs protested with pain. I ignored it, holding my son tightly. "God, Dad," he pulled away, looking me up and down. "You're really alive." "Really alive, son, and intending to stay that way." Alex approached, extended his hand, which I ignored, instead embracing him as well. "Good to see you, you old son of a gun," he said, patting me on the back. "Likewise, you limping bastard." Thomas observed our reunion with a slight smile. I introduced him to Alex and Michael, briefly explaining his story. Alex, always quick to assess people, shook Thomas's hand with respect, recognizing him as an ally. "We need to move," he said, looking back at the helicopter. "The pilot is nervous. This zone isn't the safest for flights." We quickly gathered all the evidence Thomas had accumulated and my few possessions. Boarding the helicopter, I looked back one last time at the hut that had been my refuge for almost 2 months. Strangely, I felt something like nostalgia. There, in isolation from the world, everything had been simple and clear. Thomas also looked back, saying goodbye to the place that had been his home much longer. "Any regrets?" I asked. "No," he replied, settling into the helicopter seat. "It's time to stop hiding." As the helicopter rose above the jungle, Michael shared the latest news. "Paul has announced his engagement to Mom. The ceremony is in 3 days, a small private ceremony for close friends and family. He's using this as a cover to gain full control over finances, including your insurance." "And Emily, how is she?" "Confused. On one hand, she still blames you for Ethan's death. On the other, she doesn't like Paul, though she can't explain why. He's charmed her like Mom, but not completely." "What about Ray?" drinking more than usual. After he made a full confession on camera, we limited contact. Too risky, if Paul suspects. I nodded, understanding. Ray was our main witness, but also the most vulnerable link. A man Paul could easily silence forever. "What's the plan?" I asked, looking at Alex. "First, we hide you. I have a safe place outside town. Then we put everything together, Thomas's evidence, Ray's confession, the financial documentation I've dug up. When we have the complete picture, we'll go to the authorities. And if Paul manages to marry Sarah before we gather enough evidence." "He won't," Alex said firmly. "We must act before the ceremony, catch him off guard." I turned to Michael, who was looking at the jungle passing below with a thoughtful expression. "Son, are you okay?" He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw a strange mixture of hope and fear. "We must act quickly," he said, clenching his fists. "We must save Mom and Emily before he harms them even more." I put my hand on his shoulder, feeling tense muscles under my fingers. My son, who had always been a support for his mother and sister, now carried a burden he shouldn't have had to bear at 19. "We'll save them, Michael, I promise." The helicopter flew toward the town I once called home, to my family, whom someone had tried to take from me, to the man who had destroyed everything I loved. And I swore to myself that this time I wouldn't let him win, even if it cost me my life. Chapter 3: Redemption. It's strange to return to a world that considers you dead. Faces on the streets seem ghostly, not belonging to the reality in which you exist. I looked at the town through the tinted windows of Alex's car and felt like a ghost, peering into the world of the living from another dimension. Perhaps a certain part of me had truly died in those jungles. The former John Riley, trusting despite his military experience, open to the world despite all its cruelties, no longer existed. In his place emerged another man, cautious, determined, with a single thought: to reclaim his family and destroy the one who had tried to take them away. Secret return. "The apartment belongs to a former informant of mine," Alex explained, opening the door to a small two-room apartment on the outskirts of town. "He moved to Phoenix 3 months ago. The place is officially vacant, bills paid through a shell company." I nodded, appraisingly examining the space. Minimal furniture, drawn curtains, the smell of an uninhabited space. Perfect for someone who doesn't want to be found. "Not a five-star hotel, but safe," Alex added, tossing the keys onto a worn kitchen table. Thomas had already settled on the couch, laying out documents from his metal container. His long gray hair was now neatly trimmed, his beard shortened. Alex had insisted on minimal disguise for both of us. I had also gotten rid of the jungle growth on my face, leaving only short stubble, and wore a dark baseball cap that hid most of my face. Michael sat down next to Thomas, carefully studying the photographs and documents. His young face was focused, with that special seriousness that children acquire when forced to grow up too quickly. "Here's everything we've gathered on Paul." Alex laid out his own folder of documents on the table. "Bank transactions, copies of forged documents through which he gained control of your family's finances, Ray's confession. And all of this is useless without my testimony," Thomas noted grimly. "And I'm a fugitive doctor accused of involuntary manslaughter, not the most reliable witness." "We have my word," I objected. "A living man who was tried to be killed, twice. A man who might just be on the run, or mentally unstable after losing his son, or obsessed with jealousy toward the new man beside his wife." Alex spread his hands. "Paul prepared the ground perfectly. Any version of yours will sound like the ravings of a paranoid." I paced around the room, feeling a familiar tension in my muscles, the same I experienced before complex operations in Iraq. "Show me pictures of Sarah and the kids." Alex handed over a phone with several recent photos. Sarah in our backyard with an absent gaze looking somewhere into the distance. Emily in the schoolyard, thinner, in clothes I didn't recognize, dark, baggy, concealing her figure. Michael nodded at the last photo. This is from the ceremony preparation, yesterday. In the picture, Paul stood behind Sarah, his hands on her shoulders. My wife appeared to be a pale shadow of her former self, mechanically smiling at the camera. But what shocked me most was the expression in Paul's eyes. He wasn't looking at the lens, but at Sarah, with that special look a collector has when finally acquiring a rare specimen for his collection. "Damn wedding," I muttered, clenching my fists. "I can't believe he went that far." "Technically, it's not a wedding," Michael clarified. "Some special soul reunion ceremony or something like that. Paul said a full wedding would be later, when more time had passed since your death. This is for close friends and family." "Perfect cover," Alex nodded. "After such a ceremony, he can legally act on Sarah's behalf, manage finances, make decisions regarding the children, and in a year, calmly conduct an official ceremony when no one will raise the question of propriety anymore." "What's our plan?" asked Thomas, carefully folding the documents. "If we go to the police now—" "They won't believe us," Alex interrupted. "Or they will, but too slowly. By the time they check all the facts, Paul will already be married to Sarah and will get what he wants. And if he senses danger, he might try to take them out of the country. So we must intervene directly in the ceremony." I made the decision without even realizing it. "When?" "Tomorrow, 4 o'clock, Church of St. Joseph." "Church?" I was surprised. "Paul isn't religious." "Sarah has always been a believer," Michael shrugged. "And Paul needs to create an impression of respectability, the appearance of normalcy." The next few hours we spent developing a plan. Alex used his connections to obtain a layout of the church. Thomas prepared samples of drugs found in Paul's possessions, the very ones he used to control Sarah's mind. Michael was responsible for communication with Ray, who was supposed to attend the ceremony. "What about Emily?" I asked when the main details had been agreed upon. "She doesn't know anything." Michael shook his head. "I was afraid to tell her. She's hard to say whose side she's on. Emily still blames you for Ethan, but she doesn't trust Paul either. And if she let something slip to Mom and Mom told Paul—" "I understand." I put my hand on my son's shoulder. "You did the right thing." Late in the evening, when Thomas was already asleep and Alex had stepped out for groceries, Michael and I were left alone. He was looking at a photograph of our family, taken 3 years ago when Ethan was still alive. Everyone smiling, happy, unsuspecting of the tragedy awaiting them. "I should have understood earlier," Michael said quietly, not taking his eyes off the picture. "Noticed that something was wrong." "It's not your fault, son. You noticed, tried to warn me in your last message." "Because I'm an adult and have dealt with people like Paul in war." I sat down next to him. "Predators are everywhere, in jungles, in the deserts of Iraq, in small American towns. They're difficult to recognize because they masterfully disguise themselves as ordinary people." "How do we get Mom back?" In his voice was helplessness, uncharacteristic of my always confident son. What if her mind is damaged by these drugs? What if she's never the same again?" I put my arm around his shoulders, feeling how tense he was. "Your mother is the strongest person I know. She pulled me out of dark places where I had driven myself after the war. Trust me, she'll handle this too." Michael nodded, not looking fully convinced. I didn't press. Honestly, I wasn't sure myself that Sarah would be able to fully recover after everything Paul had done to her. But I knew one thing: tomorrow I would either get my family back or die trying. Confrontation of SHADOWS. The morning of the next day dawned rainy. Small drops drummed on the apartment windows, like nervous fingers on a table. I stood by the window, looking through a gap in the curtains at the rain-blurred street, trying to comprehend the strange reality in which I found myself. Just yesterday, I was dead to the entire world, a hermit in the jungle, a man without a future. Today, I was to rise from the dead and face the one who had destroyed my life. I don't like that look on your face. Alex approached and handed me a cup of strong coffee. Saw the same in Iraq before suicide missions. Weren't all our missions like that? I accepted the cup, nodding gratefully. No, only the ones where you were in command. He tried to smile, but it came out unconvincing. John, we must stick to the plan. No deviations, no improvisation. Paul is dangerous not only because of his psychopathic tendencies, but because he's smart. Damn smart. I know. No, you don't. Alex lowered his voice, glancing at the sleeping Thomas. What I dug up about his past. This isn't the first time he's destroyed a family. There were other cases. Women who suddenly lost their husbands in accidents. Children left fatherless. Always the same pattern. He appears as a friend, a support, then becomes indispensable, and then he drew his finger across his throat. Why wasn't he caught earlier? Because he never uses the same method twice, and he always disappears before anyone starts asking questions. Changes his name, town, creates a new identity. So Paul Harris is fake too. No, that's his real name. He uses it only when absolutely confident of success. Alex sipped his coffee. And he's never been as close to his goal as he is now. We fell silent, looking out at the intensifying rain. I thought about Sarah, about the woman I met 15 years ago when I returned from my first tour in Iraq. I was broken then, full of hatred and fear. She patiently, day by day, collected the fragments of my soul, bringing me back to life. And now I had to do the same for her. I need to see our house, I said suddenly. What? That's not part of the plan, Alex tensed. I'm not going to knock on the door, I just want to see. Confirm that this is all real. He hesitated, clearly disapproving of the idea, but finally nodded. All right, but only from a distance, and you don't leave the car. Half an hour later, we were parked 2 blocks from my home, a 2-story building with a white fence and an apple tree in the yard that I had planted when Michael was 5. Despite the rain, activity around the house was noticeable. People bringing in flowers, some boxes, decorations for the upcoming ceremony. They're not doing this at the church, I asked, watching the bustle. Ceremony at the church, reception at the house, Paul insisted, apparently wants to demonstrate his status as master as soon as possible. At that moment, the front door opened, and Sarah appeared on the threshold. Even from such a distance, I could see how much she had changed, lost weight, her movements mechanical, like a marionette. She said something to a worker unloading boxes from a van, then disappeared back into the house. God, what has he done to her? I whispered. Thomas examined the pills Ray was delivering to her. It's a combination of psychotropic drugs, nothing that would seem suspicious individually, but together they create a state close to hypnotic trance. Increased suggestibility, suppression of will, altered perception of reality. She looks sick. She is sick, John, but we'll get her out. I was about to respond when I noticed a familiar figure leaving the house, Emily. My daughter, my little princess, who once would throw herself into my arms the moment I crossed the threshold. Now she was dressed all in black, with a pale face and dark circles under her eyes. She stopped on the porch, looking at the rain with an expression of such absolute loneliness that my heart constricted. I need to talk to her. I reached for the door handle. No, Alex grabbed my arm. If Emily sees you, she might get scared, scream. Paul will learn you're alive and everything will go to hell. But she's my daughter, damn it. And you'll see her today, at the church, according to the plan, which we so carefully developed, if you remember. I forced myself to lean back in the seat, not taking my eyes off Emily. She stood a little longer, then put on her hood and walked down the path toward the street. Where is she going? I began to panic. To school, I guess, or to a friend's. Relax, John, we can't do anything right now. We watched as Emily walked past our car, unaware that her resurrected father was sitting just a few meters away. When she disappeared around the corner, I finally exhaled. Let's get out of here, I've seen enough. Returning to the apartment, we found Thomas at work. He was laying out on the table drugs seized from Paul's hiding place in the jungle, comparing them with medical reference books. "Found anything useful?" asked Alex, shaking raindrops from his jacket. "Yes, and it's worse than I thought." Thomas pointed to pills of different shapes and colors. "Some of these substances are used in experimental treatment of schizophrenia. Others, for managing aggressive patients in psychiatric clinics. In combination, they create a state where a person maintains external functionality but completely submits to the will of someone they perceive as an authority figure." "Paul," I stated grimly. "Exactly. But there's also good news. The effects are reversible. Once the drugs are eliminated from the body, Sarah will begin returning to a normal state. It will take time and possibly professional help, but there should be no irreversible damage." "And Emily, was he giving it to her too?" "I doubt it." Thomas shook his head. "From Michael's description, she's resisting Paul's influence on some intuitive level. If she were taking these drugs, such resistance would be impossible." This reassured me somewhat. At least my daughter hadn't been poisoned with psychotropic substances. It remained only to convince her that I wasn't guilty of Ethan's death. Michael returned an hour later, soaked to the skin, but with important news. "I met with Ray. He agrees to help. He'll be at the church and will speak up if needed. He's in bad shape, Dad. Drinking nonstop, talking to Ethan as if he's sitting next to him. But when it comes to facts, he's clear and precise. He wants to atone for his guilt." "Good," I nodded. "What about the plan for the church?" "Everything's ready. Alex got the building plans, including service entrances. I'll be present officially as a family member. I can open the side door for you and Thomas when the time comes." Revelation at the wedding. The Church of St. Joseph was decorated with lilies and white ribbons, inappropriately ceremonial for a ceremony Paul called a modest reunion of souls. I observed the arriving guests from a van parked across the street, old family friends, Sarah's colleagues from the hospital, several of Paul's business partners. They were all dressed elegantly but restrainedly, as if not fully understanding the status of the event. "No uniforms," Alex noted, scanning the invited guests through binoculars. "No police, that's good." "Or bad," Thomas argued. "If something goes wrong, we'll have no one to turn to for help." "Nothing will go wrong," I said firmly. I saw Michael helping Sarah out of a black limousine. She wasn't wearing a wedding dress in the traditional sense, but an elegant cream suit, as always, impeccable taste, even in a state of medicinal trance. Emily walked beside her in a dark blue dress, holding a bouquet of white roses. She looked dejected, as if participating in the ceremony against her will. Paul appeared last, in a dark suit, with a perfect smile and the authoritative walk of a man who had achieved his goal. He put his hand on Sarah's back, directing her to the church entrance with a familiarity that made me clench my fists. "Not the time," Alex said quietly, noticing my reaction. "Soon." We waited until all the guests had entered the church, and then quickly crossed the street. According to the plan, Michael was to meet us at the side door 10 minutes after the ceremony began. Thomas looked nervous. He was unbuttoning and rebuttoning the top button of his shirt, glancing around. "First time in 7 years I'll appear in public under my real name," he explained, noticing my gaze. "Strange feeling." "After all this, we'll clear your name," I promised. "Paul will pay for everything he's done, not just to my family but to you and his other victims." The door opened exactly at the agreed time. Michael looked pale but determined. "Everything's going according to plan. The ceremony has started." Paul gave some speech about love overcoming death. His voice trembled with disgust. "Now the priest is reading a prayer." "Is Ray here?" asked Alex. "In the last row, barely standing but conscious." We slipped into the church through the side entrance and took position in the technical corridor leading to the altar. Through a small window, I could see what was happening inside. Sarah and Paul standing before the priest, guests filling the pews. Emily sat in the first row, staring blankly ahead. My heart was pounding so hard it seemed its beat should be heard by everyone around. I leaned against the wall, feeling approaching nausea, a combination of nerves, rage, and fear for my family. "Easy," Alex put his hand on my shoulder. "Breathe, you've been through worse. You survived a plane crash and 2 months in the jungle. You'll handle this too." I nodded, focusing on my breathing, 4 seconds in, 4 to hold, 4 to exhale. The same rhythm that helped me stay calm under fire in Iraq. The priest's voice became clearer. He had moved to the key moment of the ceremony. "Gathered here today to witness the union of Paul and Sarah. Before they pronounce their vows, I must ask, if anyone here knows any reason why this union cannot or should not be formed, let them speak now or forever hold their peace." I looked at Alex, who nodded. The moment had arrived. I pushed the door and stepped into the main hall of the church. For a moment there was absolute silence. Guests froze, not understanding who this stranger was interrupting the ceremony. Then someone gasped, recognizing me, and a whisper spread through the rows like wind through a wheat field. John Riley, but he's dead." I walked down the central aisle, looking only at Sarah. Her eyes widened, her mouth opened in silent surprise. Something flickered in her gaze, a glimpse of recognition, a struggle with the medicinal fog. "I object to this union," my voice echoed through the church. "On the grounds that I, Sarah Riley's lawful husband, am alive, and on the grounds that this man," I pointed at Paul, frozen with a mask of shock on his face, "tried to kill me. Twice." Guests jumped up from their seats. Some were shouting, some crying, several pulled out phones, recording what was happening. Emily was looking at me with an expression of absolute shock, her face as white as chalk. "John," Sarah whispered, taking an uncertain step in my direction. "This is impossible. You died." "No, Sarah, I survived, and I'm here to tell the truth." Paul finally snapped out of his stupor. His face changed. The mask of the shocked friend fell away, revealing the cold fury of a predator cornered. "This is some ridiculous joke," he turned to the guests with a forced smile. "Poor John, obviously, suffered a serious psychological trauma and now—" "Enough lies, Paul." I took another step forward. "I know everything about how you staged the accident that killed my son Ethan, how you manipulated Sarah with drugs, how you forced Ray McKenzie to sabotage my plane." At the mention of his name, Ray rose from his seat in the last row. He was swaying, his face tormented, but his voice sounded firm. "It's true, everything he says is true. I sabotaged the plane on Paul's orders, and the brakes in the car where the boy died. There's no forgiveness for me." Gasps of horror rippled through the hall. Sarah turned even paler, her hand rising to her throat as if she couldn't breathe. "Paul," she turned to him. What is he saying?" "He's drunk, Sarah." Paul took her by the shoulders, turning her with her back to me. "You know Ray's an alcoholic, and John is just jealous. He's always been unstable after the war." "I'm not here alone." I nodded toward the door where Thomas and Alex emerged. "Dr. Thomas Shepard, whom you framed 7 years ago, and Alex Murphy, my combat comrade, who gathered all the evidence of your crimes." Thomas stepped forward, his tall figure and piercing gaze capturing the attention of those present. "I treated Paul Harris's victims, and I witnessed how he manipulates people, uses drugs to alter their consciousness, eliminates those who stand in his way." "This is absurd." Paul's face contorted with rage. "You're all insane. Sarah, let's get out of here." He pulled her by the arm, but Sarah didn't move. Her gaze was clearing, as if she were waking from a long sleep. "The pills," she whispered. "You gave me pills every day, said they were for depression." "Because they were for depression," desperation sounded in Paul's voice. "You were in bad shape after John's death. I was helping you." "No," Sarah slowly shook her head, stepping away from him. I remember. Fragments. You told me John was a bad father, that he was guilty of Ethan's death. But that's not true. I know that's not true. Paul realized he was losing control of the situation. His gaze darted to the exit, assessing chances for escape. Then he did what no one expected, pulled a gun from the inside pocket of his jacket. He aimed the weapon at me. Guests screamed, some fell to the floor, others rushed to the exits. Emily froze in horror, unable to move. Sarah tried to grab Paul's arm, but he pushed her away with such force that she fell on the altar steps. Paul put down the weapon. I tried to speak calmly, taking a step forward, diverting his attention from the others. There are too many witnesses here. You won't get away. Then I'll take you with me, he aimed, his finger tensing on the trigger. The shot sounded unexpectedly loud in the church's acoustics. I instinctively ducked, expecting the impact of a bullet. But no pain came. Instead, I saw Ray Mackenzie falling in front of Paul, clutching his chest. The mechanic had thrown himself in the path of the bullet, shielding me with his body. Ray, I ran to him, dropping to my knees. He looked at me with a clouded gaze, a weak smile appearing on his lips. Tell them the truth. I can't live with this anymore. He shifted his gaze to Paul. You forced me, threatened my family. He coughed. I just wanted to atone for my guilt. His eyes glazed over, his body went limp. Ray Mackenzie was dead, having performed his final act of atonement. Paul used the moment of confusion to dash toward the side exit, but Alex was already waiting for him there, gun ready. Drop the weapon, Harris, he commanded, or I'll shoot you, and believe me, I won't miss. Paul froze, his gaze darting between me, Alex, and possible escape routes. In his eyes, I saw what many must have seen before death, the cold, inhuman calculation of a predator. It's over, Paul, I said, rising. Put down the gun. For a moment it seemed he would comply. Then Paul spun around, aiming the gun at Sarah, who was just getting up from the floor. If I can't have her, nobody will, he hissed. I lunged forward, not thinking about the consequences. Time seemed to slow down, as it does in moments of mortal danger. I saw Paul's finger pressing the trigger, saw the horror in Sarah's eyes, heard Emily scream. Alex's shot preceded Paul's by a fraction of a second. The bullet hit him in the shoulder, turning his body and throwing off his aim. His shot went straight into the crucifix, showering those present with pieces of plaster. I crashed into Paul with my whole body, knocking him to the floor. We rolled down the aisle, fighting for control of the weapon. He was stronger than I expected, and desperation gave him additional strength. She's mine, he hissed in my face, trying to point the gun at my head. Always has been mine. She saw the real me and didn't turn away. She saw a monster and tried to help. I twisted his wrist, forcing him to drop the weapon. Because she's a healer, always has been. The gun flew aside. Paul struck me in the broken ribs, causing a flash of pain, black spots swimming before my eyes. He used the moment to push me off and dash for the exit. But Thomas met him there, with a heavy metal candlestick in his hands. One blow and Paul collapsed unconscious. Sorry, but I've been waiting for this moment for 7 years. Thomas lowered the improvised weapon, looking at the fallen enemy with a grimace of disgust. Alex was already calling the police. Michael rushed to Sarah, supporting her. Parishioners crowded at the doors, hesitating whether to leave or return to the altar. I got to my feet, overcoming the pain, and saw Emily. She stood alone, lost amid the chaos, with wide eyes full of tears. Dad, she whispered, taking an uncertain step toward me. Is it really you? Yes, sweetheart. I opened my arms, not daring to approach first. It's me. She rushed to me, crashing into me with such force that I barely kept my balance. Her body was shaking with sobs. I hated you for Ethan, for breaking Mom, she sobbed, clinging to me as if afraid I would disappear again. I thought it was your fault. I know, sweetheart, and I will never stop feeling responsible for what happened to Ethan. I stroked her head, as I did when she was little and afraid of storms. But I didn't betray you. Never. She pulled back, looking into my eyes. I believe you, now I believe. This moment, amid the devastation and chaos, became the first step toward healing our family. Restoration of truth. The police investigation was thorough and swift. Ray's confession, recorded on video before his death, the medical drugs found in Paul's home, Thomas's testimony about previous victims, financial manipulations with my insurance and property, the eyewitness accounts of dozens of people present at the ceremony. All this created an irrefutable picture of Paul Harris's guilt. But the most shocking was what investigators discovered in his home: a carefully hidden safe with diaries in which he had documented his obsession with Sarah and plans to eliminate me for years. He had been watching you since the moment your wife conducted his psychological assessment for the military contract, Detective Morrison explained, showing me copies of the pages. At first, just observing. Then he began to get closer, creating the image of a family friend. The accident with your son was the first active step. It was carefully planned to cause discord between you and your wife. In other cases, Alex said there were other families. I leafed through the documents, feeling nausea at the methodical way Paul had planned the destruction of others' lives. At least 3 similar cases in different states under different names, but in none did he go this far. Apparently, your wife was special to him. She recognized him during that psychological assessment, saw who he really was. And that made her the perfect target, the detective nodded. For someone like Harris, there's nothing more attractive than a person who sees their true nature and still doesn't reject them completely. Medical expertise confirmed that Sarah had been under the influence of a combination of drugs that altered perception and memory. For her full recovery, time and professional help were required. She was placed in a specialized clinic where she could safely undergo detoxification and begin to restore true memories. For Thomas, these events became the beginning of his return to society. His case was reviewed in light of new evidence, and all charges were dropped. Moreover, his medical knowledge and expertise helped save Sarah and possibly other victims of Paul whose cases were yet to be investigated. I visited Sarah every day, sitting beside her in the hospital room, sometimes in silence for hours, sometimes talking about the most ordinary things. Gradually, her eyes cleared, her true personality returning, the strong, intelligent woman I had fallen in love with 15 years ago. I can't separate what was real and what was suggested, she admitted one day, looking out the window at the clinic's autumn garden. After Ethan's death, everything is like in a fog. I remember accusing you, pushing you away, but I don't remember why, as if someone else was controlling my thoughts. Someone else was controlling them. I took her hand, feeling her tense slightly at the touch. But now you're free, and so am I. We've both become different. She looked me in the eyes for the first time. Maybe we should start with that. I understood what she meant. We couldn't just return to what we had before the tragedy. Too much had changed, too deep were the wounds that remained. But we could try to get to know each other anew, these new people we had become. I'm ready for that, I replied, if you are. She didn't answer, but she didn't withdraw her hand. That was a small but important step. Healing wounds. Emily began family therapy sessions with me a week after the events at the church. At first, she was withdrawn, spoke in monosyllables, avoided looking me in the eye. But gradually, session by session, the wall between us began to crumble. I don't know how to stop blaming you, she said at the 4th meeting, looking at her hands. For Ethan. I know intellectually that it's not your fault that the accident was staged, but in my heart, I still see him in that car and you behind the wheel. I see it too, sweetheart, I replied quietly. Every night, and I don't know how to stop blaming myself either. Maybe we'll never stop completely. Maybe we'll have to learn to live with this pain. How did you cope? In the jungle after the crash, when you thought everyone considered you dead? I thought about it. An honest answer was important. I focused on survival, on physical actions, finding food, building shelter, treating wounds. And when it got really hard, I thought about you, about Michael, even about Mom, about how I had to return, had to protect you. Even when you thought Mom hated you. Her question was direct, without accusation, just curiosity. Even then, because I knew it wasn't her, not the real her, something was wrong and I had to figure out what. Emily nodded, as if this explanation satisfied some inner need to understand. I want to learn to be that strong. You're already stronger than you think. I carefully put my hand on her shoulder and she didn't pull away. You held on all these months, tried to support Mom, studied, despite everything happening. I want to study psychology, she suddenly said. Like Mom, to understand why people do what they do, to help those who have been through the same as us. You'll be a wonderful psychologist, I smiled, feeling a surge of pride. Michael was coping in his own way. He had always been the most rational of us, most able to separate emotions from facts. He had supported me from the first minutes of my return, and now, with the crisis past, he focused on his own future. I still want to go to the Air Force Academy, he said when we met for coffee at a small cafe across from the hospital where Sarah was being treated, but for a different reason than before. Which one? I looked at my son, who had grown up so much in the last few months. Before, I wanted to be like you, follow in your footsteps. Now I want to find my own path, use what I've learned and experienced to help others. I'm proud of you, son. I put my hand on his shoulder. You handled it better than any of us, kept the family together when everything was falling apart. It's thanks to you, Dad. Michael looked me seriously in the eyes. You showed what it means to be strong, even when the world is collapsing. Thomas Shepard received full exoneration and reinstatement of his medical license. He could have returned to practice in any prestigious clinic, but instead offered me a partnership in a new project, a support organization for pilots with PTSD and victims of psychological manipulation. We both know what it means to lose yourself and find yourself again, he said, packing around the small office we had rented. Your military experience, my medical expertise, together we can help those going through the same things we did. I agreed, finding a new calling in this work. My experience as a pilot remained with me, but I no longer wanted to return to the sky. Too many painful memories were associated with flying. Instead, I found a new way to use my skills. Now I taught others to manage not airplanes, but their own traumas and fears. Alex remained a close family friend, especially supporting Michael in his preparation for entering the academy. His experience as a private detective and former military proved invaluable in creating our support organization. A year passed since Paul Harris was arrested and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. A year of gradual recovery, painful but necessary. Michael successfully entered the Air Force Academy. On the day of his departure, our whole family saw him off at the station. Me, Sarah, who had completed her treatment, and Emily, who had enrolled in the local college in the psychology department, deciding to live at home for some time yet. Sarah fully completed her treatment and resumed her professional activities. We found a new balance in our relationship, not the same as before, more cautious, more respectful of each other's boundaries. We lived separately, I in a small apartment not far from the organization's office, she in our old house with Emily. But we met regularly, talked, slowly getting to know each other anew. I don't know if we can ever go back, she said once as we walked in the park, to what we had. I think not, I answered honestly. But maybe we can create something new, something based on who we are now, not who we were before. She nodded thoughtfully. I like that thought, a new beginning. On the anniversary of Ethan's death, we gathered at the cemetery as a whole family, for the first time without mutual accusations and unspoken bitterness. I placed on my son's grave a model airplane we had been building together but never finished. Sarah brought his favorite flowers, Emily, a new portrait, Michael, a medal received at a shooting competition at the academy. He would have wanted us to find a way forward, Sarah said quietly, looking at her son's grave, even if that path isn't together. We exchanged a long look, the first truly sincere one, without barriers of false politeness or residual hostility that had accompanied us over the past year. In her eyes, I saw understanding and forgiveness, and possibly something else, a glimpse of the feeling that once bound us together. Each member of our family found their own path to healing, realizing that the true tragedy is not in losing loved ones, but in losing the ability to love and trust again. We all lost Ethan, but thanks to this loss, as paradoxical as it may sound, we found each other anew. And in this, perhaps, lay the true price of redemption.